Hey guys, I'm Andrey, and you're welcome. In previous videos, we have covered Queen's Gambit accepted. Now it's time to get to Queen's Gambit declined. It starts after moves d4, d5, c4, and e6. So, as you can see, black doesn't capture on c4 and tends to play a bit more closed positions. So after this, white has different moves. Main are knight f3 and knight c3. They may lead to similar positions. So we will focus on knight to c3 move. So as you may notice, white is not in a rush to protect c4 because white is okay with losing c4 pawn just to occupy the center. And black is going just to protect d5. That is, by the way, the main idea behind e6 move. So black is trying to overprotect this very important central point and later to undermine the center, because as we can see already now, white has a better presence in the center. White has more pawns attacking and black is mainly defending at the moment. So black is going to complete the development of the king side, then to play something like b6 followed by bishop b7, and at some point to undermine the c5. Black has different options here. The main one is knight to f6. But we should also mention that black can undermine the center immediately with a c7, c5 move. So it is pretty sharp opening, which is called a Tarrasch defense. It used to be very popular for many years. I have also mentioned once that Kasparov contributed to this opening a lot. But nowadays it is considered not so good for black because white managed to find good ways to secure a slight advantage, actually reducing black's attacking possibilities. So the main continuation here is c takes d5. After that move, black recaptures on d5. And as we may notice here, there is a pressure on c5 and d4 squares. And in a vast majority of cases, it leads to the isolated pawn on d5. So now, white of course can think of taking on c5 immediately, but the normal flow goes like knight to f3, protecting the pawn on d4 and controlling d4 square, just to prevent black from playing d5, d4 in case d captures on c5. And white is not really afraid of black's, let's say, c5, c4 move, because in that case, of course, there is no isolated pawn on d5, but pawn on d5 is nevertheless quite vulnerable, and white will just attack it in the future by developing the bishop to g2, for example, after g3. So black usually tends to force white to take on c5 or captures on d4 a bit later himself. Why? Because, well, black actually wants to play the position with the isolated pawn. It's not because black is going to play the position with the weak pawn, but because the type of the position is quite interesting for developing the initiative in many cases. So positions with isolated pawns are quite open, that we have already understood while discussing the Queen's Gambit accepted. Black tries to exert additional pressure on the pawn d4 with the knight to c6, and white develops the bishop to g2. It is the most logical way to develop the light square bishop here, because white wants additional piece attacking d5. Black responds with the knight f6. White continues with the bishop to g2. Bishop goes to e7, continuing the development. White castles. Black does the same. And here white has two different options. The one is very simple. It is just to take on c5 already here. Black recaptures. And now, instead of attacking d5, which is not necessarily that simple, white is focusing on controlling dark squares. So knight goes to a4 first, attacking the bishop on c5. Bishop has no good squares in this a7 g1 diagonal and hence goes to e7. And then white develops the bishop on e3. So that's the point. In this position, as we can see, white has a good control over d4 and c5 squares. Normally, white tries to exchange dark square bishops because after that, dark squares will be very vulnerable in black's camp, but will be much easier to occupy d4. So the normal plan for white is just to bring the rook on c1 at some point, then to put the bishop on c5, exchange dark square bishops, and just to continue controlling d4 and c5. It's really hard for black to get decent counterplay. But if black remains solid, it's not so simple for white to win either. Another option is not to take on c5, but to force black to do that. For that, white plays bishop g5 in this position. So the point behind this move is that white exerts some pressure on the knight f6, which is the main defender of the d5 pawn. In many cases, it means that there is just a direct threat of something like d takes c5 and the bishop takes f6 and takes on d5. In the majority of cases, black captures on d4, where after knight recaptures, and we get a classic position with the isolated pawn. But if compared to Queen's Gambit Accepted, where white was actually attacking somewhere, here we don't see that black is actually very active. For now, black is simply underdeveloped. White already has very solid blockade on d4 square, and d5 is actually quite vulnerable. For example, here, if black responds with the h6, attacking the bishop, bishop goes back to e3. Pay attention to this square. White usually occupies exactly this square with the dark squared bishop, because from here it supports the knight on d4, and potentially may be relocated to this d4 square, or maybe even to c5. After that, black may continue with the rook e8, occupying the open file. White continues with a similar thing, rook to c1. Now, the knight on c6, as you may notice, is under some pressure. Bishop f8, activating the rook, and then white can transform the position. So it is one of the typical things here. So it's not necessary to play exactly against the isolated pawn. Sometimes white can just take on c6. After b takes c6, there is no longer isolated pawn on the board, but pawn on c6 becomes a new target. So after knight to a4, we may notice that c6 is a backward pawn. It's impossible to get the pattern with hanging pawns after c6, c5, because c5 is controlled, and white may continue with a nice blockade on dark squares here, knight c5 or maybe bishop c5, exchanging bishops, and then get into c5 with the knight or the rook or the queen. Literally any piece there will be quite good. And this position is actually very, very annoying for black. For a quick reference, I may mention the game Akiba Rubinstein against Sullivan. It's a classic example on how to play in this pawn structure. So I strongly recommend to look at that game. As I said, Tarrasch defense is no longer that popular, mainly because of the lines I showed you. So let's get back to the main line. So the main move is knight to f6 here, just continuing the development and protecting d5 additionally. White has a choice here. It's possible to continue with the bishop to g5 move, which is actually the good old main line. Another possibility is to develop the bishop on f4, but not necessarily right now, after the move knight to f3. So both lines have advantages and disadvantages. In this particular case, in this video, we are focusing mainly on bishop to f4. So the next move is knight to f3. And before getting to the main line, which starts after bishop e7 and bishop f4, let's have a look at another version of Tarrasch. So black may try c5 in this position, and it is a so-called improved Tarrasch defense. So what is actually the improvement? The knight is already on f6, so after white's c takes d5, in addition to e takes d5, which may lead to simple Tarrasch defense, black may consider taking with the knight. And this is absolutely different type of position. So what is the advantage of this capture? Well, there is no isolated pawn. The disadvantage is obviously that black is losing control over e4 square, and white may use it right now. So white normally continues with the e4. Not to lose time here, black captures on c3, because if knight simply goes away, it means that black lost 2 tempi, captured on d5 and went away. So knight takes c3 is the main direction. And after b takes c3, we may notice that white managed to strengthen the center. Now d4 is well supported by the pawn. But the pawn structure is a bit damaged here, because the a pawn is abandoned. It's no longer supported by the pawn from adjacent file, because that pawn has disappeared. It's now in c3. But white has a very good center now. So advantages and disadvantages once again. Black may continue with the c takes d4. It's one of the main directions here. C takes d4. There are plenty of different options. One of them is bishop to b4 check, just continuing the development with the tempo. Of course, white doesn't have anything better than bishop to d2, where after bishop captures on d2, queen captures on d2, leads to very interesting pawn structure. So the interesting part here is that you can reach this pawn structure from different openings, not necessarily from the improved Tarrasch defense. Sometimes you get something very, very similar in Nimtsovich. You get something very, very similar in some lines of Queen's Indian defense. So knowing the features of this pawn structure may help you to play different openings. So what's the point here? Black still has to improve the light squared bishop, so to play b6 and bishop b7. And white will use that time to develop some initiative in the center and potentially on the king side. Let's have a look at this. First castling, then bishop goes to c4, very active development of the bishop, also controlling d5 square. Knight goes to c6. Also, nothing to comment here, it's just very natural move, development, exerting some pressure on d4, potentially intending to play knight to a5, dealing with that bishop. White castles. Now it's time to play b6, developing the light squared bishop. And white starts occupying d and e files with rooks. They are closed files, but white is intending to be active in the center, so with the help of this rook a to d1 with a subsequent rook to e1, white prepares a breakthrough. Bishop goes to b7. For now, black is fine. Rook goes to e1. For example, rook goes to c8. And now it's time for white to get aggressive. And here it comes. So d5. Black is actually in sort of trouble already, because if he takes on d5, then white has two interesting options to take with the pawn, a tempo move. Another one is just to take with the bishop, where after white will have a serious presence in the center, followed by e5 and e6 probably. White can get some sort of, pretty nice initiative, while black is not having actual targets. So the normal way to react here is to play knight to a5, intermediate attack against the bishop. Bishop steps back now, maybe surprisingly, to d3, because look, d5 is sort of hanging. But after e takes d5, white usually reacts not with capture on d5, although it is possible, but with the e5. And now we can see that white has sort of majority on the king side, so 4 pawns against 3. Bishop is super active on b1, h7 diagonal. There are different threats, including knight to g5, bishop to h7 at some point, obviously e6, different maneuvers of the pieces towards the king, like queen through f4, somewhere to g4, to f5, at some point to h4 as well. Black is having extra pawn, but it's very hard to convert it. Obviously, it's just too early for conversion. And the bishop is not necessarily that active anymore. Let's say knight goes to c4. Why not? After ed5, this square is available, but queen goes to f4, getting closer to the king. And after something like knight to b2, of course, it's probably not the best move, but I just want to demonstrate the idea. White has some nice perspectives after the sacrifice on h7. For example, king takes h7, knight jumps to g5 as check, already looks very dangerous. For instance, if king goes back to g8, there is a possibility to continue with the queen h4, and it's not clear how to prevent the checkmate, or at least just a crushing attack. If rook e8, then king is quickly forced to the center, and we should never forget there is something like e6 always ready. So king should most likely go to g6, where after white may continue the attack with the h4 move, intending to play h5. Let's say rook goes to c4, h5. It's getting really hard to survive it, because if king takes on h5, there is g4, actually forcing the king to h6. If king goes to h6 immediately, there is a possibility to take on f7 with double check, forcing the king further to h7. Then queen goes to f5 with check, king goes to g8, and now white continues with the e6. So yes, it was a sacrifice, so white is a minor piece down at the moment, but the attack here looks really dangerous. So black may probably take on d1, but there is also e7 coming, so white is threatening not only with the attack, but with something connected with this extremely powerful e6 pawn. So this position definitely requires some additional analysis, but it's clear that white has the initiative. And the main idea to show you all these lines was obviously to make you understand basic ideas behind this pawn structure within the improved Tarrasch defense. Now let's get back to the main line. So here black plays bishop to e7, continuing the development of the king side. And as I said before, white has a choice between bishop to g5 and bishop to f4. In this video, we are discussing bishop to f4. So this line became popular not so long ago. I mean, if compared to bishop to g5. Yeah, bishop f4 was also played in the past, but it was hugely analyzed much later compared to bishop to g5. And it became quite popular several years ago, once again. What is the idea behind bishop to f4 move compared to bishop to g5? So on g5, the bishop exerts pressure on knight f6, which is quite logical because white is fighting for e5 and d5 squares, and the knight f6 is the main defender of these squares. On f4, though, this bishop exerts pressure on c7, and not only on c7, but it is playing an active role along the whole h2b8 diagonal. Whenever black thinks of playing something with a c pawn, either c6 or c5, it has to take into account that all the squares along this diagonal will be weakened. So after bishop to f4, obviously black castles. White also continues with the development by playing e3. And now black has a choice. So nowadays, knight to d7 is considered the main line, but let's have a look at c7, c5 move, which was quite popular not so long ago. So c5 means that black is fighting for the center in a very aggressive way, and there is some logic behind it because, as we may notice, white made a lot of moves with the pieces thrown on the queen side, so the king is still in the center, and this may promise something in the sense of potential attack or at least some tricks. So in this situation, black is ready to recapture d5 with the knight. It will not help to avoid the isolated pawn, but the point behind taking with the knight is to get rid of the knight c3, and this will weaken diagonal a5, e1. Why it is important? Well, let's have a look. Let's say white starts with a d takes c5 here, bishop captures on c5, and let's say white captures on d5. So if we simply capture with the pawn, well, we get the position with the isolated pawn. It may be not so bad, but still a bit annoying. If we take with the knight here, then after knight takes d5 and e takes d5, there is still an isolated pawn, no questions. But here is an additional threat. It is bishop to b4 check. So white has already developed the bishop and played e3, so there is no good defender of the king here in case of check. Obviously, white doesn't want to play something passive like knight to d2. This means white most likely has to spend one more move on a3 move, and black has a good chance to get rid of the isolated pawn rather quickly. So he plays knight to c6 with the simple idea of playing d4. After bishop to d3, white cannot really prevent it, in fact. Black prepares d4 with the bishop b6 move. Why it's important? Because if you play d4 immediately, you may get into a trap after b4 and b5, so you should be careful attacking the knight, and then taking on d4. So bishop b6 is quite useful here. Moreover, this bishop is quite vulnerable to a different thing, like bishop takes h7, followed by queen c2 check, and takes the bishop. So it's another threat after bishop to d3. Bishop goes to b6. Now white castles. Black continues with the plan d4. Why not? And if white captures on d4, everything is just fine. So black more or less equalizes the chances and has no problems. But white continues with a very good move, e4. After e4, black is still having this pawn. It's no longer a classic isolated pawn because, well, it is a passed pawn, but it's still blockaded in a very safe way. So black cannot use this passer in the nearest future. Another problem with black's setup here is that bishop b6 is a bit stupid now. It's limited with the own pawn and cannot exert pressure on white's position. Anyway, this position is not so bad for black. According to my experience and to the stats, well, this position is quite playable. After, say, bishop g4, h3, and bishop to h5, white should be pretty aggressive to prove that he has some chances in this case. And the best way to demonstrate it is to play immediate g4, after bishop to g6, knight to d2, and overprotect in e4, combining it with some initiative based on f4, f5, and so on. White will have some interesting play on the king side and in the center. Black will try to compensate it, obviously, with resisting there. So black always has some resources, like to play f6 to control e5 better and to hide the bishop on f7 in case of f4, f5. There are also some ideas of using slight vulnerability on the queen side on b3, so sometimes you may see something like knight a5, knight b3 maneuver, but it's not the nearest future, obviously, so I would say in this position white has slightly better chances. Another option for white is not to take on d5 at all. Let's have a look at that one as well. So in this position, white plays queen to c2 move. Very interesting continuation. So white is not against this d5 takes c4 exchange, because in that case the d file becomes open, c file becomes open, and it feels like white is better prepared for this opening, because rook can go to d1, attacking the queen, and queen doesn't necessarily have a suitable square to go away. So black is usually trying to avoid taking on c4 here for as long as possible. Knight goes to c6, the main continuation, also creating a sort of threat like knight to b4 at some point. White may continue with the a3, very useful move, because whatever happens, either the pawn remains on d5 or there is an exchange of these pawns, white will have a very interesting way to grab additional space on the queen side with the b2, b4 move. One of the ways to prevent it for black is to play queen to a5. Right now, b4 is not possible because the rook on a1 is not protected, so if white plays something like b4 here, then black may simply capture it with the knight or with the bishop. So it's not possible to take the bishop because queen can take the rook. So to make this threat real, white usually plays rook to d1. Very useful move anyway. And now b4 threatens, so black has to make a decision what to do with that. Obviously, black has just played queen to a5, so moving the queen away somewhere makes no sense. Normal reaction is to play bishop e7, simultaneously protecting the pawn on d5. And this position used to be very popular several years ago. Well, it's still playable. I mean, it's still interesting to investigate for both sides. So one of the latest improvements here is knight to d2 move. So very interesting possibility to play against the queen. White prepares different things, including simple knight to b3, and then queen doesn't have a good square. Black may continue with the active e5 now. It feels like a very natural response to knight e2 because e5 is no longer controlled, but the problem is that d5 becomes more and more vulnerable. Bishop goes to g5 now. The d5 square is really not possible to protect, but it feels like black may continue with the d4 move. In this position, white continues with the knight to b3, attacking the queen and the pawn on d4, literally forcing something like queen to d8. So d4 is protected for now, but it's not necessarily that safe. So after simple bishop to e2, continuing with the development, castling, and then exerting additional pressure on pawn d4, white may have some direct play, so black must think what to do with this problem and find some counter chances. So position is not that clear. Now let's get back to the main line, which is popular nowadays, which is knight to d7 against bishop f4. So in this position, instead of undermining the pawn with the c5, black tries to play knight to d7. At very first glance, it looks pretty strange and pretty passive. But that is exactly what black wants here. So black wants to play a super solid position, avoiding all complications in the center before he's ready for it. So black shouldn't be afraid of the attack against c7 right now, because, well, For example, after knight to b5, there is a bishop b4 check, forcing the knight back to c3, let's say, or forcing the king to e2, and black always has the possibility to protect this pawn. So yeah, it looks super passive right now, but just give black one more move, and it's not a problem, in fact. And there may be some like c6, forcing the knight away, or maybe a6 with a similar idea, and then the knight will get back to the active position. So knight b5 is just a one-move threat. Instead, white usually grabs the space with the c5, which looks much more logical here. Black has to undermine this pawn, otherwise it will be really hard to play. So first, black blockades the pawn with the c6. It's easier to attack them, because if you start with the b6 at some point, there is a huge risk that after c6 you will not find a good square for your knight, and this pawn will be very powerful after white protects it. So c6 to blockade the pawn first prior to attacking. Bishop goes to d3 now, continuing the development. White's position looks very good for now, but black starts active counterplay on the queen side. b6, white wants to protect the pawn on c5, because taking, well, it just loses a lot of advantage that white has because of this pawn on c5, I mean the advantage in space. Black continues with the undermining activity with a7, a5, now attacking b4, which protects c5. White protects that pawn as well. Well, after b6 and a5, as you can see, everything is ready to get rid of the bishop c8. So this is the main problem for black in Queen's Gambit. And here black has, at first glance, very nice possibility to exchange light squared bishops. Why cannot just go away with the bishop? Well, it's actually possible, avoiding the exchange of bishops, but then it's really hard to make castling. So normally white would react with either capture on a6 or castling. Let's start with capturing on a6. So this is very interesting line, because after rook takes a6, black is ready to play b6, b5, where after black will be, well, at least not worse, and there will be a nice possibility to open the position on the queen side, but actually at the moment, which is good for black, because only black will kind of have the power of exchange on b4. White is not dictating here if black manages to play b5. But the problem is that white can play b5 himself here. And after c takes b5, white continues with the c6, getting very powerful passer. So now, if knight goes to b8, then obviously c7 wins the game instantly. So instead, black has this trick queen to c8. So the idea is that if c takes d7 happens, then queen takes on c3, and black is more than fine. So instead of doing that, white continues with the c7 move, actually saving the pawn on the board. And now, to protect the pawn on b5, black plays b4, actually securing the extra pawn, but after knight to b5, white has a long-term compensation for missing material. So it may be even two pawns if black captures on a3. White doesn't want to capture back, I guess. But look at this pawn. So it's really powerful. It limits the activity of black's pieces here. So it's not so simple to play. But with the proper play, I guess black should hold it. Finally, the castling option. So after bishop to a6, white doesn't take on a6 but castles. Let's have a look at that one. So in this position, white castles. Now black can prepare everything properly by playing queen to c8. I mean, this helps black avoid all these complications connected with b4, b5. White plays h3, queen goes to b7, queen goes to c2. For example, right now black can capture, bishop takes, queen takes. Then black starts preparing his play on the queen side, because it is literally the only side where black can play in this position. White controls everything in the center and king side. Well, there is the king. So rook goes to a7, preparing doubling the rooks. Knight goes to d2. Another rook goes to a8. So as you can see, there is already a threat of taking on b4 and then capturing the rook on a1 in case white recaptures on b4. So white should rather go away. Then there is an exchange on b4, and rook may go to a3. So it's also possible probably just to close the position after b5, but black should be very careful with that because it weakens a5 square, and white has just played knight e2, being ready for that. So if black plays b5, there's most likely knight b3 followed by knight a5, closing the a file for black. It is bad. So most likely it's better just to keep this pressure, waiting for white to capture on b6, in which case black's bishop will finally have the target. So the position is quite complicated, playable for both sides, definitely requires some additional analysis, and if you want to play this in your games, of course you have to analyze it deeper. But anyway, I think now you have a deeper understanding of what the main line with the bishop f4 is, what is the Tarrasch defense and improved Tarrasch defense, and you can probably start practicing. In the next video, we're going to discuss the old main line, bishop to g5, instead of bishop to f4, and also Carlsbad pawn structure. So stay tuned.